If you grew up in Britain, the chances are you rode to the seaside in a Duple, even if you never knew the name. The panoramic window, the moquette seat, the smell of warm vinyl in someone's cigarette. Nearly every coach that carried a school trip to the coast or a family holiday to Blackpool was built by hand in a single factory, 3 streets from Bloomfield Road. At its peak, Duple finished 1,000 coaches a year. They survived the war, building Halifax bomber fuselages before going back to coach bodies, survived a 36-week strike that nearly broke them, survived a move from London to Lancashire and 4 changes of management. They adapted, retooled, and kept the gates open through everything the century threw at them. And then, after 70 years of making, the factory went silent. How does a company that carried a generation to the seaside simply disappear? What really happened? Chapter 1: The Hampshire Man and the 3-Minute Trick. The story begins not in Blackpool but in Hampshire, with a man who couldn't interest anyone in his idea. Herbert White was born in Salisbury in 1877, a small-town engineer, not a London industrialist. Before the First World War, he'd been building cars in Fareham under the name Byford, a word that carried the same two-purpose duality he'd spent his life chasing. The Byford was a convertible, a touring car that became a van when you swapped the rear deck. 1 vehicle, 2 lives. White believed that was the future, a single chassis that could earn its keep 6 days a week as a tradesman's van and take the family out on Sunday. He spent the war years pitching the concept to established bodybuilders. Every one of them turned him down. So, in 1919, he did what autodidact engineers of his generation did when the establishment said no. He found cheap premises, a small factory in Pembroke Road, Hornsey, in North London. Bought ex-military Ford Model T chassis, flooding the market after demobilization, and started fitting his convertible bodies himself. The conversion took 3 minutes. Unbolt the rear touring deck, slide on the van top, and you had a delivery vehicle. Reverse the process on Saturday evening, and you had a car for the weekend. He offered a pickup variant and an extraordinary version with raising sides and slide-out display shelves designed for market traders, a mobile shop front on a Model T frame. The name he chose was Duple. 2 purposes, 2 lives from 1 machine. It was a modest enough ambition. It would sustain a company for 70 years. By the mid-1920s, the convertible body market was saturating. Demobilized soldiers who'd set up as small-time hauliers with war surplus lorries now wanted proper commercial vehicles, not clever parlour tricks. Britain's charabanc trade, works outings, seaside day trips, was exploding, but the 1930 Road Traffic Act was already casting its shadow, and the bus and coach industry was professionalising fast. White needed to pivot, and in 1928 he found the man who would make it possible. Walter Ernest Brown had been a partner in the Strachan and Brown coach-building firm. He arrived at Duple with something White lacked: overseas connections and a relentless commercial instinct. Brown had already travelled extensively in North America. After joining Duple, he embarked on a Mediterranean sales tour through Greece, Syria, and Egypt that opened export markets across East Africa, Argentina, and the continent. Those export orders did something vital. They smoothed the brutally seasonal UK coach trade, where British operators placed orders in autumn for summer delivery, and the factory stood half idle from May to September. By 1930, 2 years after Brown's arrival, Duple had built 250 bus and coach bodies. Within a decade of the pivot from convertible cars, Hendon employed around 800 people. The breakthrough customer was London itself. In 1930, Duple landed a 50-body order for AEC Regal chassis destined for Green Line coaches, the new express arm of the London General Omnibus Company. 50 coaches, 1 order. It was the kind of contract that turned a small North London workshop into a serious industrial operation. And then, in August 1931, Vauxhall Motors launched its new Bedford passenger chassis, the WHB 14-seater and the WLB 20-seater, and recommended Duple as one of 4 approved bodybuilders. That Bedford recommendation would define Duple for the next half-century. It was the partnership that made the company, and it began not with a grand strategic alliance, but with a line in a chassis specification sheet, naming a small Hendon firm alongside 3 others. Chapter 2: Fuselages and Freedom. By the time war came, Duple had moved from Hornsey to a larger factory at the Hyde, Hendon, the site that became the company's spiritual home. But what happened inside those walls between 1940 and 1945 had nothing to do with coaches. The Ministry of Aircraft Production formed the London Aircraft Production Group in the summer of 1940. 5 companies, coordinated by the London Passenger Transport Board under Lord Ashfield's chairmanship, tasked with building heavy bombers. Duple's assignment was the front fuselage shell and components of the Handley Page Halifax. Park Royal Coachworks took the outer wings and engine cowlings. Chrysler Motors at Kew built the rear fuselage. Express Motor and Bodyworks at Enfield handled the intermediate wings and tailplane. Final assembly happened at Leavesden Airfield near Watford. The first complete LAPG Halifax was handed over on the 6th of January, 1942. The 710th, named London Pride, took off from Leavesden on the 16th of April 1945, 9 days after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. Over half the workforce that built those bombers were women with no previous engineering experience, turning coach finishing skills to the tolerances of airframe assembly. Duple's wartime managing director, G.F. Watts, was personally thanked by Lord Ashfield at a reception at the Dorchester Hotel in December 1944. A coach builder from Hendon acknowledged in a Park Lane ballroom for helping to build the aircraft that flattened Hamburg. That was the scale of what these firms had done. In parallel, Duple built utility double-deck buses and bodied the Bedford OWB, the only new single-deck passenger vehicle produced in Britain between 1942 and 1945. Its slatted wooden seats were an austerity discomfort that a generation of wartime passengers never forgot. Peace brought the vehicle that would make Duple a household presence, if never quite a household name. The Bedford OB with Duple Vista body, a design dating from 1936 on the earlier WTB, modified into the longer Hendonian, and fitted from 1939 to the new bullnose Bedford OB, became the British rural and seaside coach of the late 1940s and 1950s. 29 seats, a distinctive curved waistline, and a diesel note that meant the same thing from Aberystwyth to Scarborough. The holidays had started. Wartime had cut Bedford OB production to just 73 chassis. Post-war, they poured off the Vauxhall line at Luton, and Duple bodied them by the hundred. The Vista was the coach that took mill workers to Blackpool, took Sunday school outings to the coast, took demobilised men and their young families on the first proper holiday they'd had in 6 years. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't need to be. It was freedom on wheels, and Duple built the body that made it feel like an occasion. A catastrophic 36-week labour strike in the early 1950s convinced Duple to look beyond militant London. The company acquired Nudd Brothers and Lockyer at Kegworth in 1952, added premises in Loughborough in 1955, and took over Willowbrook Ltd of Loughborough in 1958. But the acquisition that changed everything came in August 1960, and it took Duple to the seaside. Chapter 3. The Resort That Built Coaches. Herbert Victor Burlingham had understood something about coach building that nobody else in the trade had fully grasped. He moved to Blackpool in 1928, leasing premises in Bloomfield Road and Bond Street, because a seaside resort offered a unique advantage for a business as brutally seasonal as coach bodywork. The coach building season, when operators specified and ordered for the next summer, ran from September to May. In Blackpool, that aligned perfectly with the resort's winter trough. Skilled coach finishers laid off in June could walk straight into summer work at the pleasure beach, the hotels, the boarding houses, the bars. The same hands that stretched aluminium over wooden bucks in February pulled pints in July. It was an elegant solution to an intractable problem, and it created a labour ecosystem that no inland factory could replicate. Burlingham's masterpiece was the Seagull, launched in 1951. A coach so distinctive that when Blackpool FC won the FA Cup in 1953, the team paraded the trophy along the promenade on top of one. It remains the single most famous image of a Burlingham-built vehicle. Stanley Matthews' Blackpool, their cup, their coach, their town. When Duple acquired H.V. Burlingham in August 1960, it inherited all of this: the seasonal workforce, the customer base, the skills, and the peculiar circular economy of a factory that built the coaches that brought the holiday makers, whose spending sustained the town, whose workers built the coaches. Renamed Duple Motor Bodies, Northern, in 1962, the Blackpool operation produced its own models: the Bella Vista, the Continental, the Bella Vega, and the Vega Major for the 6-wheeled Bedford Val. But the real significance was strategic. In June 1968, Duple announced that all coach production would consolidate at Blackpool. The Hendon plant, bodybuilding there since 1927, bombers since 1940, would close. The transition nearly killed the company. Commercial Motors' interim report of May 1969 revealed an 18% sales drop, an expected trading loss of £220,000 and £80,000 in redundancy and removal costs. Chairman H.W. Sydenham retired. His replacement was the 39-year-old Deputy Chairman, J.O.R. Darby, a chartered accountant, the first sign that financial management was displacing engineering instinct at the top. Managing Director J.R. Chisnell was moved sideways to run the plastic subsidiary, replaced by J.G. LaRougetel, the former Hendon production director. When Hendon finally closed in 1970, output had fallen to just over 400 bodies. In that same year, Plaxton of Scarborough, Duple's lifelong rival, passed 1,000. It looked briefly as though Blackpool might have been a fatal mistake. The Vicarage Lane works had been extended by 48,000 square feet, with a further 72,000 square feet and 24 acres acquired in 1969. All of it underused. The seasonal labour pool that Burlingham had exploited so cleverly was thinning. Duple's own interim reports noted difficulties attracting sufficient qualified labour as full-year tourism and competing employers like the Burton's Biscuit Factory, ICI Hill House, and the expanding airport at Squiresgate drew from the same limited pool of skilled hands. And then, within 5 years, Blackpool roared to life. The Duple Dominant launched at the 1972 Commercial Motor Show and at a glamorous press event at Lake Garda. All-steel construction, deep panoramic glazing, a styling that deliberately echoed Plaxton's Panorama Elite of 1968. A long strike at Blackpool meant only one Dominant was available at the launch show, which ought to have been an omen. It wasn't. The Dominant caught the market perfectly. The Dominant 2 of 1976, restyled by Michelotti of Turin with rectangular headlamps in an integrated grille panel, a deeper windscreen and cleaner lines, was the coach that defined an era. And the era it defined was the British coach holiday at its zenith. Imagine the pickup. A Bedford YMT or a Leyland Leopard idling outside a terrace in Leeds, or a Semi in Solihull, the diesel ticking over, the driver in his grey jacket checking names against a clipboard. You climbed aboard and the smell hit you first. Warm vinyl, fresh moquette woven by John Holdsworth and comers of Halifax, the faintly sweet scent of cellulose paint that hadn't quite finished off-gassing. Then the seat, Holdsworth cloth in a pattern you'd recognise 40 years later, a fold-down armrest that clicked into place, and a headrest at exactly the height that told you this wasn't a bus. This was a coach. This was going somewhere. The panoramic windows stretched nearly to the roofline, which meant that sitting in a Dominant as a child, you could see the tops of hills as well as their bottoms, the Lake District unscrolling above you, not just beside you. The Bedford diesel settled to a motorway hum. Someone opened a thermos. The cigarette smoke started early and never entirely left for the life of the body, and when the coach pulled into a depot forecourt at Bournemouth or Blackpool itself, the driver swept the chrome handle to open the front door with a theatricality that said the journey was over and the holiday had begun. Wallace Arnold Tours of Leeds ran Duple Dominants on their Blackpool services, the preeminent middle-class touring operator, whose coaches collected passengers from the West, riding in the Lancashire mill towns on runs that Burlingham had bodied before the war. Grey Green of Stamford Hill ran a notable Dominant fleet on Bedford YMTs from 1976. National Express, the National Bus Company's express network, was a major customer. Smith's Shearings, Barton Transport, Burnley, Colne and Nelson, Ulsterbus, Epsom Coaches, Bournemouth Corporation, the Scottish Bus Group, virtually every Bedford YMT, Ford R-Series, Leyland Leopard and Volvo B58 sold to the UK touring, school and works outing trade wore either a Duple Dominant or a Plaxton Supreme body. Together, the two firms were a duopoly. There was, as the trade press noted, very little competition other than small numbers from Willowbrook. By 1976, roughly 1,000 completed coaches a year were leaving the Vicarage Lane gates, 20 a week on a 50-week year. Duple held an estimated 40% of the UK coach bodybuilding market. Commercial Motor would later describe them as the second largest luxury coach builders in Britain, behind Plaxton. But in the mid-70s, the two were neck and neck, and the roads of Britain were paved with their work. Chapter 4. The Summit. The pure peak, output, confidence, market position, was approximately 1976. The Dominant 2 had just launched with Michelotti's Turin styling. The Plaxton duopoly was humming. Holiday touring sat at a post-war high, and Britain's expanding motorway network was driving express coach growth faster than anyone had forecast. 17 million visitors a year came to Blackpool alone, a substantial fraction of them arriving by coach, many of them by duple-bodied coach, built in the same town they'd come to visit. There was no triumphalism. Coach building was a quiet, regional industry. Nobody at Vicarage Lane gave speeches about market dominance. The pride was in the work, in a finished body rolling through the gates with its operator's livery gleaming, the moquette seats immaculate, the panoramic glass catching the filed coastlight. But standing at that summit, the warning signs were already visible to anyone who chose to look. Labour disputes recurred at Blackpool with a regularity that suggested structural problems, not isolated grievances. Duple had no integral coach development programme, no plan for a vehicle where chassis and body were engineered as a single unit, the direction every serious European manufacturer was already heading. The company's entire business model rested on lightweight Bedford and Ford chassis, the workhorses of the British touring trade, at exactly the moment when continental integrals from Belgium, the Netherlands and Germany were maturing into serious competitors. And Plaxton, steadily, quietly, was widening its production lead. 1,000 coaches a year, 20 a week through the Vicarage Lane gates, the Holdsworth moquette, the Michelotti lines, the Bedford diesel settling into its motorway note as another Wallace-Arnold tour headed north. It was the highest point, and from here, every step led down. Chapter 5. The Act, the Chassis and the Invaders. Three forces converged on Duple in the space of 36 months, and not one of them arrived with a warning letter. The first was political. Margaret Thatcher's first Transport Minister, Norman Fowler, brought the Transport Act 1980 into force on the 6th of October that year. The Act took express coach services, those over 30 miles, entirely outside the road service licensing system that had regulated British coaching since 1930. Overnight, anyone with a coach and a route could compete with National Express. The immediate winners were new entrants like British Coachways and the rapidly modernising National Express itself. The strategic consequence was subtler and more lethal. Operators no longer wanted a comfortable touring coach for gentle A-road runs to Bournemouth. They wanted fast, heavy, motorway-capable machines that could compete on time with British Rail. The lightweight Bedford or Ford chassis that had carried Duple's business for 50 years was suddenly, visibly, obsolete. The second force was mechanical. Operators pushing Bedford Y-Series and Ford R-Series coaches into high-mileage, high-speed motorway service discovered what the chassis engineers could have told them. These vehicles weren't built for it. Gearboxes failed. Frames flexed. Both manufacturers eventually withdrew from coach chassis production altogether. The market migrated to the heavyweight Leyland Tiger, launched in 1981, and above all to the Volvo B10M, which would outsell the Tiger 20,000 to 3,500 over the following decade, and ultimately consume Leyland Bus entirely when Volvo bought it in March 1988. Duple had built its reputation, its tooling and its workforce skills around lightweight chassis. The chassis it knew how to dress were disappearing. The third force came from the continent. Van Hool from Belgium, Bova from the Netherlands, Jonckheere from Belgium, Neoplan and Cetra from Germany. These manufacturers offered something Duple and Plaxton couldn't: integral coaches, where the chassis and body were engineered as a single unit, aerodynamic, modern, with continental specification interiors that made even a good Dominant look dated. The Bova Europa, in particular, was credited in the trade press with introducing the integral concept to many British operators who'd never considered buying foreign. Commercial Motors' August 1983 feature described its impact on the British market as major. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. 1,000 bodies in 1979, 800 in 1980, just over 500 in 1981, under 500 in 1982, 340 in 1983. In 4 years, Duple lost 2/3 of its output. 20 coaches a week through the Vicarage Lane gates became fewer than 7. Duple tried to respond. The laser body for normal floor coaches and the Caribbean for high floor work arrived in 1982. The Calypso appeared on a Bova Futura underframe, Duple literally bodying a competitor's chassis in an attempt to stay relevant. Plaxton commissioned Ogle Design to create the Paramount range, launched at the 1982 British Motor Show. Neither company reversed the slide. The integrals kept coming, and the lightweight chassis kept disappearing, and the 5-year Transport Act 1985, Nicholas Ridley, as Transport Secretary this time, deregulated local bus services and forced the privatisation of the National Bus Company into 72 separate entities, each one uncertain about its future, each one reluctant to invest in new vehicles. Duple's two biggest market props, Bedford Chassis and NBC Fleet orders, were both collapsing simultaneously. Inside the factory, the vulnerabilities ran deeper than any external shock could explain. The two-site Blackpool layout inherited from Birmingham, Preston New Road plus Vicarage Lane, resisted the kind of modern flow-line production that Plaxton was achieving in Scarborough. Strikes recurred. Underinvestment in metal-forming machinery meant Duple's panel work still relied on skills and time that Plaxton was automating. And the board, after the Hendon-era engineers gave way to financial managers in the early 1970s, lacked the deep coach industry instinct that might have seen the integral revolution coming 5 years earlier, when there was still time to act. By June 1983, when the rescuer arrived, Duple was already on its knees. Chapter 6. The conglomerate's Gamble Hester Group was a 1970s-style industrial conglomerate assembled by David Hargreaves as an investment vehicle. It had taken Eagle Engineering and Yorkshire Vehicles in 1971, then acquired Dennis Brothers of Guildford in March 1972, a 35-acre red brick factory making bus chassis, fire engines and refuse vehicles. Renamed Hester Dennis, it gave Hargreaves something no other British group possessed, a complete chassis manufacturing operation. The logic of buying Duple in June 1983 was seductive. Hester Dennis made chassis. Hester Duple, as the Blackpool operation was immediately renamed, made bodies. Combine them and you had a vertically integrated British coach builder capable of producing complete vehicles to fight the European integrals on their own terms. Dennis cab production was moved from Guildford to Blackpool, announced in Commercial Motor in March 1985. Approximately 14 acres of the Guildford site were sold for redevelopment. For a brief, optimistic moment, Blackpool was the centre of a new British commercial vehicle business. The October 1985 reorganisation installed the team that would manage Duple's final years. Richard Owen, former Deputy Managing Director of Dennis Guildford, became Chief Executive of Hester Duple. Steve Burton, previously the Blackpool Production Director responsible for coach and cab building, became Managing Director of Dennis Specialist Vehicles. Barry Mealing, Deputy Chairman of Hester Duple, took a group product development role. Peter Ragg remained Managing Director of Hester Duple Sales. These were competent men. They inherited an impossible position. The flagship of Hester's strategy was the Duple 425, an integral coach, rear-engined, with a Cummins L10 or DAF power plant, automatic transmission, and a streamlined upper windscreen that gave it a drag coefficient of 0.425. Hence the name. 57 seats, or 53 with a toilet. Built from Cromwell 3CR12 high-chrome stainless steel for corrosion resistance, with double-skin GRP lower panels. Commercial Motor road-tested it in October 1987 and found it the most fuel-efficient coach in its class. 13.3 miles per gallon over a mixed route at an average 50.6 miles per hour, cruising at 112 kilometers per hour at just 1,700 revolutions per minute. It was a genuinely good coach, and it failed. The problems were threefold, and each one fed the others. The 425 arrived too late. Bova, Van Hool, Neoplan and Leyland's rival Royal Tiger Doyen had already carved up the integral market. It was too visibly tied to the Dennis chassis. Operators loyal to Volvo, Leyland or DAF avoided a Duple product that locked them into a Dennis powertrain and a Dennis dealer network. And the parts and service infrastructure was thin compared with established continental dealers, who'd spent a decade building UK support networks, while Duple was still fitting dominant bodies to Bedfords. About 130 were ever built. A basic Cummins-powered version started at around £77,800, 130 coaches from a factory that had built 1,000 a year barely a decade earlier. The 300 series, Duple 300 city bus, 320 coach, 340 tall coach, the numbers denoting centimetres of height, launched at Earl's Court in September 1985 as replacements for the Laser and Caribbean. The 320 found a niche on the Dennis Javelin chassis, accounting for about a third of Duple's coach output, but total volumes kept falling. New jigs, anti-corrosion spray booths, automated drilling, Hester invested in modernisation that would have transformed the factory if there had been enough orders to justify it. There weren't. The Hester-Dennis tie-up, designed to fight the Europeans by creating a complete British vehicle, had achieved the opposite. It had narrowed Duple's market to operators who were willing to buy Dennis. And Dennis, for all its engineering quality, was not Volvo, not Leyland, not the chassis that the newly privatised, newly cautious, newly cost-conscious British coaching industry wanted to stake its future on. By 1988, Duple was building 250 bodies a year. Hester had poured £14 million into Blackpool over 5 years. 10 million of that was simply to cover accrued losses. The conglomerate had gambled on vertical integration, and the market had folded the hand. Chapter 7. 8 months. In November 1988, Hester sold both Dennis and Duple to a management buyout team operating as Trinity Holdings. The deal was led by Jeff Holyhead, former head of the Hester Vehicle Division, who became chairman and chief executive. The stated intention was to stabilise the businesses and eventually relist Dennis on the London Stock Exchange. Duple was renamed Duple International. Plans were drawn for new bus bodies, including a design for the Scania N113. The promise to employees was continuity. 8 months later, Holyhead closed the coach building operation. Commercial Motor reported the decision on the 20th of July 1989. The rationale, in Holyhead's own words, was that there were conflicts between Trinity's roles as a chassis manufacturer and a bodybuilder, and that Duple coach builders had been unprofitable for several years because of reduced orders as the national bus company moved through privatisation and deregulation. Approximately 350 workers lost their jobs. Not 800, that figure, sometimes cited, conflates the 1930s Hendon headcount with the smaller 1989 Blackpool operation. 350 is devastating enough. 350 skilled coach builders, panel beaters, trimmers, painters, electricians, body makers, in a town that was already losing its industrial base to cheap package holidays and the long, slow retreat of British seaside tourism. Production continued at Blackpool for roughly 6 months to complete outstanding Dennis Dart bodywork orders for London buses. Some workers were offered transfers to Plaxton's Scarborough plant. Many walked across town to the filled borough transport works at Squires Gate or to Blackpool Transport's Rigby Road workshops. Plaxton paid £4 million for the manufacturing rights and jigs for the Duple 300 series and the 425 Integral, plus Duple services, the spares and repair business, with sites in London, Blackpool and Glasgow. The Dartline minibus design went to Carlisle Works in Birmingham. Duple Metsec, the export bus body kit subsidiary, remained with Trinity and was eventually sold to Mayflower Corporation in 1998. Plaxton's role was strictly commercial. They bought distressed assets at distressed prices because the assets were on offer. There is no evidence they engineered the closure. Trinity concluded on its own that coach building was the past and the Dennis chassis business was the future, and history bore that judgment out. Dennis, later Alexander Dennis, became the dominant UK bus chassis maker. The Plaxton-bodied Dennis Dart became the standard British single-deck bus of the 1990s and 2000s. The combination that Hester had tried to create, Dennis chassis, British body, worked after all. It simply didn't need Blackpool. The Duple name was never revived as a manufacturing brand. Chapter 8. Vicarage Lane. Afterwards. The Preston New Road Works was bulldozed. What replaced it was described by a Blackpool transport history writer as nondescript business park development, the kind of brick and panel offices that could be anywhere in Britain, carrying no trace of the fuselages and coach bodies that were built on the same ground. Vicarage Lane survived in a more complicated form. The former Duple coach builders' office block still stands. Behind it, a cluster of small specialist coach and bus bodywork firms continue the trade in fragmented form. Jackson Coaches operates from the same lane. The wider road hosts a screwfix, a tool station at the Woodman Centre, a garage, small commercial units. A visit won't yield a cinematic ruin. What it yields is a low-rise industrial estate vernacular of single-storey units and functional signage, behind which a handful of firms still hand-finish coach panels using skills that trace a direct line back to H.V. Burlingham's first Bloomfield Road workshop in 1928. The workers dispersed into Blackpool's fragile economy. Some went to Squiresgate. Some went to Rigby Road. Some went to the independent coach repair firms that absorbed the skills the corporate structure couldn't sustain. The coach-building knowledge survived. The company that had organised it didn't. Duple's closure preceded a slow industrial attrition that would strip Blackpool of its remaining manufacturing identity. Lewis's department store closed in 1992, taking 220 jobs. TVR, the sports car maker at Bristol Avenue, collapsed in 2006 with 260 redundancies. Each loss was absorbed because Blackpool had been absorbing losses since the package holiday began draining British seaside resorts in the 1970s. 350 skilled jobs from Duple in 1989 was significant but survivable. What was not survivable, what no single closure could reverse, was the cumulative disappearance of the work that had given these streets their reason. Chapter 9. What the silence keeps. Duple coaches survive in preservation. Bedford OB Vistas appear at rallies and at Coach and Bus Live, polished to a condition their original operators never achieved. Preserved Dominants, Lasers, Caribbeans, 320s and the rare 425s sit in private collections and museum halls. Oxford Diecast produces a range of 1.76 die-cast Duple-bodied models. Alan Townsend's 1997 book, Duple, 70 Years of Coach Building, remains the standard reference. A Facebook group called Duple Motorbodies, the Hyde Hendon keeps some former worker memory alive in a medium that would have baffled Herbert White. But the preservation is for enthusiasts. The experience was for everyone. Almost every adult who grew up in Britain between 1955 and 1985 has the memory. The Bedford diesel idling outside the terrace, the moquette seat, the panoramic window framing the tops of hills, the smell of warm vinyl, cellulose paint and stale tobacco, the chrome handle the driver swept to open the front door when the coach finally reached the sea. Almost none of them know the word Duple. They don't know that the body around that memory was built by hand in Blackpool, in a factory that sat 3 streets from Bloomfield Road, by workers whose fathers and grandfathers had done the same work in the same building since 1928. They don't know that the same skills built Halifax bomber fuselages, or that the moquette under their legs was woven in Halifax by the same firm that supplied the seat cloth for London Transport. They don't know that a Hampshire man named Herbert White started it all with a 3-minute trick on a Model T, or that a conglomerate called Hester poured £14 million into the business and still couldn't save it, or that a man named Jeff Holyhead closed the gates 8 months after promising to keep them open. They just remember the coach, the window, the feeling of going somewhere, 70 years of coach building, 1,000 bodies a year at the peak, 710 Halifax bombers. The FA Cup paraded on a seagull along the Blackpool promenade, and at the end, a screwfix and a tool station on Vicarage Lane, behind which a few small firms still bend aluminium in the old way, in single-storey units that carry no plaque and no sign of what once filled these lanes with the sound of rivet guns and the smell of cellulose and tea. Not through one disaster, not through foreign competition alone, or government policy alone, or a single boardroom miscalculation. Through all of them arriving together, the act, the chassis collapse, the continental integrals, the conglomerate's well-intentioned stranglehold, in a decade that British coach building could not survive. The gates at Vicarage Lane are still there. The coaches aren't, and the silence where the panel beaters worked has a weight to it that the screwfix next door will never quite explain.